Hi, good morning. My name is Chung Min Lee, a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C. I'm here with my colleagues from Carnegie, including Darcie Draudt-Véjares, Michael Raska from Singapore. He's at the RSIS NTU, and Yea Kyung Han in Seoul at 11 o'clock at night. So, Yea, thank you so much. She's from Hanwha Aerospace. And last but not least, Markus Garlauskas from the Atlantic Council. I'll briefly introduce our panelists before we go in. The reason why we're having this webinar today is because I'm focusing on this year's major study at Carnegie is on NATO's defense ties with South Korea. And the reason why I chose this topic was because for the last several years, unfortunately, the outbreak of the Ukrainian War, states have really spiked. And so I wondered whether this was a long-term relationship that was sustainable or whether the ROK would face stiff competition from really well-established European defense firms. And for example, the South Koreans are bidding for a huge submarine deal with the Canadians. And the Canadians, we are going to compete with a consortium run by Germany and Norway. And this is just one example of how far South Korea's arms industry has developed over the last 15, 20 years, but especially over the last 3-4 years. But before we begin, I'd like to do two things. I'd like to welcome our online audience, both in the US and worldwide, as well as the fact that we just had a very successful APEC 2025 summit meeting in Gyeongju, South Korea. And I attended a pre-event sponsored by Hanwha Aerospace on defense innovation that Yea Kyung Han and her colleagues at Hanwha organized. So what I would like to do briefly is to ask our panelists what they thought about the key takeaways from the APEC summit, and then our main topic. So let me begin with Yea, since you were there for the last several days. So if you could give us your take on what the pluses and maybe even the shortcomings of APEC 25.
Right. Thank you, Chung Min. I'm honored to join this conversation. So from an industrial vantage point, the key takeaway for me from the APEC 2025 was not simply the announcement regarding the nuclear power submarines or the possibility of building SSNs at the Philly shipyard, which is owned by Hanwha. But the significance is not a headline about a single platform. It is an allied industrial pathway. So it implies that building next generation undersea capabilities inside the allied yard and also to the allied standards and within the allied regulatory and the security framework. That pathway accelerates timelines, embeds an interoperability from day one, and de-risks capacity by tapping an existing ecosystems of the suppliers, certification regimes, and also the workforce pipelines. So in other words, it converts strategy into the production. So my takeaway from the APEC is this. So the South Korea's SSN ambition is not about the prestige hulls. It is about the allied undersea resilience, and the Phillips shipyard pathway show how industry can make that real quickly and credibly.
Okay, thank you. Michael, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I just want to follow on this. We have been talking about, South Korean defense industry for a long time, always in the context of techno-nationalism. And the idea was always, pursuing self-reliance. And the idea was, that the South Korean defense industry will have the capability, to produce these technologies on its own. And oftentimes, we have been very critical on that approach. Why should South Korea develop its own submarine, its own tank, its own, APCs, just to say basically it's a self-reliant thing. And so for many years, we've been very critical. And now, the era of this techno-nationalism is kind of evolving, kind of like what Yea Kyung Han said, from this military, from this self-reliance to more, this I would say, joint development of arms, or these joint interdependencies, where you have this collaborative approach to defense innovation. And I think this is kind of like a new tech partnerships that are, evolving. If you take, for example, the AUKUS, if you take the Quad, and if you take the Ally, announcement with the sub. So I think it's sort of a strategic shift going more on these collaborative defense partnerships where you can try to leverage different competencies and strengthen the time it takes to develop these platforms and systems.
Thoughts?
Darcie, yeah.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I couldn't hear you cut out the name, which is the most important part. Yeah, I watched APEC with a lot of interest because it was a return of Korea to a hosting diplomacy that it had picked up a lot in the early 2010s. And I think it really allowed Korea to shine. I've long been an advocate of Korea embracing this idea of a middle power role through things like hosting diplomacy and how it can advance its own national agenda through convening, through helping set an agenda. And I think that APEC showcased a lot of this. So certainly a lot of the headlines were on the sidelines, the bilateral sidelines, particularly between great powers that happened on the sidelines of Gyeongju. But something that was, I think, important to note is what the content of the APEC summit was. So as Ms. Hanna pointed out, industry played a really important role in driving a lot of the agenda, particularly in the emerging tech domains, where a lot of both economic and security futures are being driven, right? It's the private companies that are driving a lot of these. So it's really important that some of the events were involved a lot of private sector convening. The other thing that I do think is really important and we could talk about how this actually foreshadows what Korea means for NATO is that the idea of interregional and cross-regional partnerships are so important for our geopolitical future, our security future, our defense future, because the emerging challenges that we're seeing in both the strategic and the economic domain aren't really relegated to particular, small geographies anymore. Korea's problems right now aren't Northeast Asia, they're global, right? And this is reflecting what's going on in the world. So I think this is something that it has a very clear through line to what Korea can do, not just in the Indo-Pacific region or Asia-Pacific region, but also cross-regionally with established economies and strong strategic powers like in Europe.
Great. Markus, I know that you've been watching, besides APEC, the 50th U.S. ROK Security Consultative Meeting and the Military Consultative Meeting that was just held in Seoul between the two Secretaries of Defense. Could you give us your take on what you saw from those events?
Yeah, so very much along the lines of what we were just hearing, definitely a broader view of the ROK-US alliance that came out from the military committee meeting and from the security consultative meeting. And so there hasn't been a formal joint statement issued from the security consultative meeting yet between the defense minister and the defense secretary, but the two chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff did release a joint statement. And I think there's some really powerful language in there that shows how the view of the alliance is evolving beyond just a focus on North Korea. In particular, you note that they talked about the increasingly complex security environment in the Indo-Pacific and intensifying global arms competition. So it's important to keep in mind, even though we're looking at the positive side of the defense industrial cooperation between South Korea, the United States, and other like-minded countries, that we're also in competition because we see defense industrial cooperation going on between North Korea and Russia, and of course China and Russia as well. And so the idea that deterrence extends beyond the Korean Peninsula and that the alliance is part of contributing to regional deterrence is something that General Jin and General Kane agreed to. So I think that's a very important aspect of the discussion. Another piece of the conversation has been on alliance modernization and the need to enhance alliance capabilities, to focus on interoperability, and to be proactive in the approach to responding to the evolving security environment and how the threats are evolving. And so they agreed to make progress on alliance modernization as well in this broader context. So I think defense industrial cooperation, technological cooperation is a part of underpinning that. And again, this view that the alliance transcends just a Korean peninsula focus, I think is going to be an increasing element of the alliance conversation, how we think about working and planning together, not just between the US and South Korea, but also, again, with the other like-minded countries in the region and particularly in Europe.
Great. Well, thank you for that opening for all of you, and especially with Markus giving us a take on the outcome of the SCM and the MCM. And so let me now turn to the main topic of this webinar, which is what are the, I guess, the reasons why South Korea is becoming a critical player in its own way for NATO defense after the outbreak of the Ukrainian War. In 2024, as you all know, South Korea supplied NATO with 6.5% of its total arms. Now, I don't think that is sustainable because we will face stiffer European competition down the road. But 10 years ago, this would have been basically impossible. Nobody would have paid attention to South Korea as a crucial arms supplier to NATO European states. But that is what we're seeing today. But as Markus said, this is not just about selling arms. It is, I hope, a much deeper security, defense, innovation, and R&D partnership. So let me then turn to all of you for your, I guess, beginning remarks on what you think are the key points of a growing NATO-Korean relationship. And this time, let me begin with the first of this relationship.
Thank you, Chung Min. Well, I think just like you mentioned, I think the war in Ukraine basically exposed that the new Q economy of arms. So suddenly there has been such a great demand for defense industrial production and defense needs that that allies had to supply Ukraine. So in this the Ukraine war basically was a catalyst for a lot of the changes in terms of Europe, in the US, and anywhere else. I think it really enabled the Korean defense industry to really step in where the European defense industry wasn't able to do so. And so in my recent op-ed, I've wrote about this idea of this new Q economy of arms, where basically defense industrial production takes a long time, right? To if you take the major weapons platforms, fighter jets, artillery, tanks, and all that, it takes such a long time to deliver that. And so it really doesn't matter, what you buy. What matters more is when you get it. And I think this is where South Korean defense industry was able to really to step in and basically as a supplier that could deliver at a pace and scale that the Europeans basically could not. That's a point number one, right? But point number two is also, European defense industry, we cannot see them as a sort of a monolithic, sort of European NATO monolithic in a way space. We have to understand that there are different requirements and different ecosystems and different needs. And I think Korea was able to really, for example, connect with the Polish defense industry and Poland, because it's a really very much a state-owned defense market. You have Poland, Romania, and the Baltics. These are basically state-owned defense systems, and they need to prioritize speed, rearmament, and localization of industrial sovereignty. But remember, Poland is not, for example, Czech Republic or the Nordics, where the defense industry is very much based in small, medium enterprises or private companies, right, where they need in different types of partnerships. And then you have the traditional defense industrial primes in Western Europe, like in France, Germany, right, Italy, and Spain. They are basically anchored in these traditional defense industrial primes, and they are very much guarding the traditional European defense market, and they are, I think, very cautious whether they can actually allow the Korean take their market share. So overall, again, the war in Ukraine basically established the need. It was the catalyst. The Korean defense industry stepped in. The countries like Poland was able to utilize that advantage. But Europe as a whole has been trying to, step up their defense industrial production, but it's a very much also a patchwork of different capabilities, defense industrial systems and strategies. And this is where South Korea will need to navigate through if it wants to solidify its presence down the road.
Myself, I think there are some technical issues that I have from my end, so I do apologize in advance for our audiences online if they cannot hear me well or my voice might be patchy. Let me now turn to Yea Kyung Han, because as you know, Hanwha, amongst other companies, has been in the forefront of expanding South Korea's defense footprints in NATO Europe. So Yea, can you give us not only a Hanwha perspective, but a broader Korean defense industrial perspective on why we are becoming an important player in the NATO market and what you see as a major speed bumps or challenges ahead?
Right. From the corporate side, I see South Korea and NATO cooperation evolving into like three distinct ways. First, complementarity. So the European firms excel in traditional defense technologies such as BAE, Rheinmetall, Saab, while Korea excels in industrial scaling, cost efficiency, and rapid delivery. So the South Korea does not replace the European defense industry, but rather we accelerate it. So second, interoperability, which is quite important in this nowadays. So the Korea is non-NATO nation, but it's already fielding NATO standard systems such as K9 howitzer artillery or the multi-missile launchers and the air defense solutions across the eastern flank. So this reduces integration time and then also the strengthening deterrence. So the third part that we found is that the trust through the delivery. So what we've learned for the last 3 or 4 years is that in wartime or crisis, promises do not matter, delivery does. So Korea delivered to Poland, as Markus mentioned, that the Korea delivered to Poland within or even in under a year. So that changed mindset across the Europe. But as Chung Min mentioned, that there are two concerns we cannot ignore. The first is the growing the bi-European or maybe strategic autonomy sentiment. We see increasing political pressure within Europe to prioritize European-made systems. So South Korean companies fully respect this. And our approach is not to export into Europe, but to produce within or even with Europe through the co-production of local value creation and shared IP where appropriate. So the second thing is, I think it's almost all the companies are the same issues, but the critical minerals and the rare earth dependencies. Every major defense program today, from propulsion systems to advanced sensors or chips as well, depends on the materials for which supply is concentrated in a very small number of jurisdictions. So this presents a structural risk. I'll stop here.
What's your take on South Korea's growing defense ties with NATO? Obviously, we have AUKUS. We have Japan's 6th generation fighter program that they want to build together with the UK and Italy. So this cross-pollination is something that countries are taking seriously. And of course, the Japanese arms industry in many respects is just waking up. And the new government under Prime Minister Takaichi wants to really ramp up Japanese defense exports. So if you take all that into consideration, how do you see the future of NATO-South Korean defense cooperation, including much, I guess, more specific South Korean arms sales to European partners?
Who is it for, Chung Min?
Yeah, this is for Markus.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, you cut out when you were saying who it was. Yeah, so I want to sort of put forward a clarification, and that is we sometimes talk about South Korean cooperation with NATO and use that interchangeably with South Korean cooperation with European countries, right? And so South Korea's cooperation with NATO as an institution, of course, is through the IP4 framework, as all of us on this call know. And then there's also, as you alluded, Chung Min, the different sort of bilateral and multilateral arrangements that South Korea has with different European countries. And so my focus has actually, frankly, been more on cooperation between NATO as an institution and South Korea, in a broader sense. But I think what you raise here is a very important point, that these different bilateral and multilateral forms of cooperation from a defense industrial perspective are actually probably more important than cooperation with NATO itself as an institution. And I think that the main thing, though, for NATO South Korea cooperation that is relevant for defense industrial cooperation is the fact that NATO's system of standardization of technology, of doctrine, is a really useful tool to be able to get so many different allied countries using a common basis for many things. Now, I'm not saying it's perfect, but my recommendation and my thought on how to move forward in the most effective way is actually to do more to connect NATO itself and NATO South Korea cooperation, actually to help set the stage for this improved defense industrial cooperation. And so, but to go back to your original question, I see some key areas of cooperation and some key aspects that are worth mentioning. So one is the promise of the Pillar 2 of AUKUS. And so for those of you not familiar with the details, or those at least listening, the focus for the AUKUS agreement, Australia, UK, US, has been on Pillar 1, which is the submarine cooperation to develop eventually Australia's ability to produce its own submarines based on a trilateral design. But Pillar 2 holds a lot of promise, 8 different work streams to develop capabilities jointly between the 3 countries. And Pillar 2 is what actually offers the opportunity to bring in additional partners beyond just the original 3. And so I do think one area where we could see defense cooperation increase, defense industrial cooperation increase with the UK is through leveraging the AUKUS Pillar 2 opportunities, whether it's the work streams that have to do with hypersonic capabilities, anti-submarine warfare, AI, quantum computing, autonomous vehicles, these sorts of things. But then also looking in the other direction, at how the European countries can engage with South Korea to provide opportunities to enable improvements in areas where South Korea has not traditionally had its strengths. And so this is one area where I think there's been a lot less examination. It's been more about I think Europe leveraging its, or I should say Europe's demand for whether it's munitions, heavy armored vehicles, places where South Korea already has an advantage in strength, and what are the things that in terms of technology transfer from Europe to South Korea that would further enable South Korea's defense industry. I think that's an area worth exploration. I think South Korea right now is often being looked at in terms of, hey, here's all this capacity, as we were just talking about, things that South Korea can essentially take up the slack, so to speak, in terms of the amount of munitions or the amount of heavy equipment that Europe just can't match. But I think what we're not seeing as much of is what can Europe offer in the other direction besides just paying for this sort of equipment. And I think that's an area that needs further examination, and particularly when you're looking at the challenge that South Korea is likely to face from drones in the event of a conflict with North Korea. This is an area where Europe is really on the cutting edge because they're on the battlefront right now. I mean, yes, there have been drone incursions into South Korea, but you don't have South Korea under constant attack like you have Ukraine. You don't have this battle lab in South Korea like you do in Europe. And so I think, I just came back from Taipei and we spent a week there. And one of the key themes that we discovered really is that Taiwan really can benefit tremendously from the battlefield experience that Europe is getting facing drones and other other Russian capabilities and tactics. And so I think ensuring that South Korea gets the data, gets the lessons learned from the war in Ukraine, and even from, frankly, the performance of North Korean systems against Western built systems in Ukraine, that can be tremendously valuable. So I would like to see more information, more again, lessons learned, technological innovation coming from Europe to South Korea to feed a virtuous cycle, rather than just viewing South Korea as an additional capacity to just produce more equipment on an existing basis.
Okay, well, those are great points, Markus. So let me quickly turn to Michael and then Darcie for their views on whether this is a sustainable relationship. Michael?
Well, I think, again, it depends on many factors. It's really how Korea is going to really plug and play with a different patchwork of European defense industries. Like I mentioned, different countries will have different needs and different systems. So if, for example, if South Korea can position itself as a partner in these private-led markets, and they can co-develop, and share IP and integrate into that, into that system of defense innovation. That's, I think, where it has a chance. And then again, you will have a different. Again, then you have the traditional Western European primes. They are a lot more reluctant and, of course, a lot more cautious, right? So how do you develop potential projects together with them, not only, again, for the European market, but also for elsewhere? But I want to go back to also what Markus mentioned. I think this is really something interesting, and I think sort of the broader point. For many years, I mean, the security discussion in terms of South Korea was always security terms in the security South Korea and the U.S. So you have the, of course, U.S.-South Korea alliance. So all the defense and security-related matters were basically embedded into that ROK-US sort of partnership and its evolving waves. And I think what the war in Ukraine really showed is this growing Asia-Europe security linkages. So you have this new triangle where you have Europe, Asia, and the US, kind of working together and sharing, trying the different avenues, a new path, like Yiki mentioned, on defense industrial innovation and other ideas. So for the first time, I think after that South Korea is really fundamentally present on that security defense related front in Europe through its capacity to deliver the arms that Europe needs at the time where European defense industries cannot do that. But I think as Europeans are going to accelerate the defense industrial production, right? The idea is really to be there for the South Korean defense industry to be there at this time, and to develop the joint, joint development of arms or sort of joint partnerships together, rather than just sort of, what Markus said, just sort of being a supplier. Because in the next 5 years, whoever is not going to be there now, it's going to be left out. So I think it's really important for South Korean defense industry to really diversify its strategy vis-a-vis different European, markets and different European defense industrial, patchworks. So, and in doing so, it can be perhaps sustainable going forward.
I know that you are focusing these days on among others, the aerospace industry and what that means for Korea. Could you elaborate on that and how that, links into the work that you're doing on possible NATO Korean cooperation on defense?
Yeah, sure. I just published a paper on Friday on Korea's new space industrial policy. So specifically targeting cislunar or near Earth orbit development. And I think this is really important when we think about, it has lessons for broader or other domains of defense industrial development for a variety of reasons. The first of which is the space domain right now is an emerging area for strategic competition, but it also defies traditional geographic boundaries. And this is something in particular that obviously NATO has in mind, and the Asia Pacific does too, as the challenges that they're confronting are different than they were in the past. The other important thing that we found in the paper, in my conversations with people here in Washington, in Seoul, in Daejeon, was that how much it depends on, one, private sector innovation, two, accessing markets across boundaries, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second, but also three, just how much the challenges are for catching up in these advanced technological domains depend on integrating very quickly into a new not just governance and legal frameworks, but technological. So in the space domain in particular, you're contending with all these sorts of new physics that you don't necessarily have to in ground or naval systems. And so this is something where was really, left an impression on me when I was doing my research for this in Korea this summer, was how much Korean firms, and I mean both the big firms like Hanwha, bigger companies, KAI, but also a lot of SMEs and startups are really working both within the country, but across borders. And so something that's really remarkable is that these technological innovations can't just happen at the national level. They're happening transnationally. So it's very important for countries to help form the strategic partnerships in the private sector that's also advancing their security goals. So the final thing that is worth mentioning, and this is something that both Michael had really laid out really well before, but this is really about ecosystems. It's not really about specific capabilities or technologies. When we're developing these advanced weapon systems or these advanced technological systems, it really involves so many components. And the reason why I mention this is also because when we think about how Korea can contribute to, for example, defense industrial development, questions about procurement, R&D, IP sharing with Europe, it's not just about, for example, the tanks that Korea can build or the munitions that it can send, but also the fact that it's also one of the world's most competitive providers of chips and batteries. And these are components that are really important to next generation systems when we think about electric tanks where batteries can be swapped out really easily on the field, or chips that are a really important component to the future of drone warfare. So Korea isn't necessarily just bringing particular assets, but actually a whole innovation ecosystem when it's working across borders too.
That's a great point, Darcie. But let me ask Yea, if you look at how Korea's defense industry has really spiked, although the Koreans are doing very, very well. So could you basically explain why the Korean defense industry has been so successful, not only in Europe, but in the Middle East and also parts of Asia, and how that all ties in to maybe even stronger ties with our partners in NATO?
Right. So from the Korea's industry perspective, defense industry cooperation with Europe began from economic demand, but it is rapidly shifting into the security-driven necessity. So at the outset of the war in Ukraine, European governments were urgently seeking to replenish the depleted inventories. So the immediate motivation was the economic and logistical. So they needed capacity quickly, and the Korean industry could deliver on speed, scale, and liability. But as the war endured, something changed. The strategic environment shifted. So as Markus and Michael mentioned earlier, the North Korea DPRK began supplying munitions and missile components and even soldiers to Russia. And we now see the evidences of growing military collaboration between them. So suddenly the European theater and the Indo-Pacific theater were no longer separate. So we became interconnected security fronts, two sides of the same strategic coins. So in that context, the Korea-Europe Defense Cooperation is no longer just about filling the backlog, but it is about the shared deterrence across the two regions that is increasingly linked by adversarial coordination. And if you, Chung Min, if you ask me about the Korea's distinctive characteristics or the successful stories, I think it's about that I previously mentioned about the three key factors. But from our end, the most distinctive thing is that they trust through the delivery. I mean, as I mentioned, that for the last couple of years, what we as a company learned in Europe is that the delivery is one of the most important factors rather than any other promises. I'll stop here.
Yiki, if I could ask you just an add-on question. Obviously, Hanwha has a global supply. So when you say delivery on time, does that also apply obviously to your global and also Korean supply chain partners? How do you make sure that the supply chain is basically it goes on 24/7?
Yep, good question. Let me put it in this way. So basically, in our supply chain is based on the local supply chain. So we do have a manufacturing facilities in European theater, and two of them. One is in Poland, and the other one is in Romania. They are basically based on in Polish SMEs. Some of that are coming from the Korea, but most of them, and whereas most of the Korean manufactured products are fully supported by Korean suppliers, which is locally supplied our own global supply chains. So that is the key, that we are reducing the delivery time.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thank you, Yiki. We have a question back from the online audience, Mike Nelson from Carnegie by coincidence. And he wants to know, South Korea faces much more intensive cyber attacks. So how could South Korea leverage NATO's Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence going ahead? And what are the barriers?
Should I answer this?
Michael?
Yeah. Well, I believe that South Korea has joined the CCD-COE as a partner in 2022, and the South Korean National Intelligence Service is cooperating with the NATO CCD in terms of, I believe, training and exercises. So I think, in a way, in terms of exchanging information, intelligence sharing, threat analysis, I think there has been already a number of exchanges and cooperation that can, of course, be obviously accelerated and deepened. And I think it's an interest on all sides to really share intel and on evolving cyber threats. I don't think South Korea is the only country where is a for targeting for the North Koreans. I think North Korean cyber strategies have been, very much global and has been significantly evolving over the last 10 years or so, where they have, really stepped up this technological social engineering capacity to really, generate currency. So, 20 years ago, as North Korea was generating currency, was selling arms and missiles. Now they're focusing on cyber-related crime and cyber, ransom and cyber threats to generate their money. So I think it's not only South Korea is a target, but it's a global. And I think that's why, NATO and South Korea and everybody else, have to work together to identify these constantly evolving cyber operations by North Korea, and also work together really to identify, and really, focusing on attribution, on aligning the political attribution when such attacks occur, and try to mitigate the risks. So I believe, this is not an area where NATO and South Korea and European countries, abroad and broadly everybody else can work together to mitigate these challenges and risks.
All right, thank you, Michael. Let me quickly turn to Markus and Darcie. But Darcie first, on the same question to Markus as well. What do you think the Trump administration believes going forward is good for Korea-NATO ties? There have been some news that the U.S. wants the Asians to focus on Asia and the Europeans to focus on Europe, and that this European-Asian defense collaboration, as good as it may sound, really is in certain respects a waste of time. So Darcie, you first, what is your take on how the U.S. government sees growing Korea-NATO ties?
Yeah, that's a tricky question. I'm curious to hear how Markus answers it too, because I think right now I'm hearing different schools of thought within the Trump administration or those around it on what it means for the United States' future in Europe versus Asia. What does it mean with a broader potential, refocus on the Western Hemisphere, meaning specifically the Americas, right? We're seeing that right now. And that matters in this conversation because it really does show how there's different views of what it would mean for both our allies in Asia working together, meaning what would the future of trilateralism look like? Even right now, I think there is a general sense among this administration that continuing closer collaboration, for example, between Korea and Japan makes a lot of sense. But then what does it mean also for cross-regional with NATO? I think right now we don't really necessarily have a clear answer. There's a few different signposts. I think the one thing that I will say is it's very clear that the Trump administration is very results driven. They're very interested in the bottom line. And so since when it comes to questions of burden sharing, questions of defense capabilities in the defense industry, in the conversations with partner countries, with allied countries around the world, including especially Europe and Asia, where the United States has its strongest traditional allies, the question is about how much are you contributing to your national defense in budgetary terms? And then what are you contributing to, weapons systems? I think that the conversation around how Korea is contributing to the American ships industry in particular, both in commercial and now increasingly in the naval domain, is a really important indicator of how it's going to be seeing what its allies can contribute. So right now, I don't really have necessarily a clear, vision about what that means for cross-regional in the case of Korea to NATO. But I can say it's very clear that the bottom line, like contributing to U.S. interests on the bottom line, is Korea contributing, in terms of the munitions it's helping in the Ukraine effort or helping supply Poland. These are important talking points for this administration.
Markus, your thoughts, please.
Yeah, as Darcie alluded at the beginning, saying that there is a Trump administration position on this overall question perhaps is tough, right? Because there are multiple individuals with different views, and there has been, I would say, some mixed signals. So I would say, for example, Ambassador Whitaker has been quite strong on NATO, Indo-Pacific ties, and even to the point of visiting, Seoul's representative in Brussels, and understand having some good conversations there. So that having been said, I think there's several different elements about NATO, Indo-Pacific cooperation, NATO-Korea cooperation, where there's different focus and priorities. I think, again, Darcie alluded a little bit of this, but I want to emphasize a couple of key areas. One is force posture. And so this is pretty clear, and I think it's intuitive, the idea that given the distances involved, there's not really a strong expectation, even discouraging expectation, I think, by some leaders in this administration, the idea that European military assets are going to move to the Indo-Pacific in the event of an Indo-Pacific conflict in large numbers, or certainly vice versa seems even less likely. So notwithstanding things like the recent Japanese fighter deployments to Europe for training, these sorts of things are going to be sort of more smaller scale, anomalies rather than the baseline expectation. And so I think that's where a lot of the negative view comes from. Essentially that, we don't want to have Europe take its eye off the ball of deterring Russia or Indo-Pacific countries deterring North Korea and China. But that's separate, in my view, from the technological cooperation, from the defense industrial cooperation. And so this is an area where I see very positive de facto signals from members of the administration, certainly support for the idea of building those connections between the defense industrial bases, building the exchange of technology. And then, of course, the diplomatic cooperation, I think, to be fair, is another category outside of the purely defense realm. But the idea that that Indo-Pacific countries, European countries, U.S. allies like South Korea can contribute to a bigger approach to situations like say things like abusive practices with technology, or some of these broader concerns that the United States has that can transcend any particular region. I think that's also an element. So I think it's premature and perhaps oversimplification to say that this administration has been discouraging cooperation on this front, but more that the idea of large force movements back and forth between the regions is something, or even significant deployments, is something that this administration doesn't seem particularly interested in.
Right. If I can add your opinion that Washington's priority is clarity of responsibility, I guess. So the South Korea is not seeking to replace Europe in Europe, within the Europe. So we, as the RK, reinforce European resilience through the industrial support, not by a shifting strategic focus. So that's why we can, Hanwha and also the other Korean defense companies are also working in the transfers in the US and the European domain as well at the same time.
Okay, what I would like to do is, thank you, Yiki, for the industrial perspective. And in the time that we have left, what I really want to do is ask each of you, what should Korea do or not do if you want to make sure that Korea becomes a critical player in the European/NATO defense market over the next, let's say, 5+ years? And so let me just begin, and then this would be part of the concluding remarks. Let me go to you, Michael, because you have been intimately involved in studying how countries, especially smaller countries, are able to innovate rapidly. So, people talk about AA-driven platforms and so forth. What do you think is the core thing that Korea must do to elevate its posture in NATO?
Well, it's not an easy question, and there are no one particular pathway. There are multiple pathways. Anyway, first of all, again, we have to distinguish between the political strategic elements of all this. So getting closer to NATO, Korea, what does that really mean, right? Is it really closer, is it the idea that alliance is expanding and the whole narrative to that can be used, for example, by China and Russia? So look, NATO is expanding to Asia, and the whole, perceptions of that and sensitivities. Or are we talking about, again, more on that defense industrial production ecosystems alignment, defense innovation, and finding complementarity, where South Korea can synchronize, several of these ecosystems in Europe? And I think it's really the latter. It can provide, it can play as an enabler, as a synchronizer of some of the capacities that Europe is still lacking now. And it can provide, again, some of the know-how on how to scale up the traditional defense industrial production. But at the same time, because South Korea has been always at the very edge of the tech front, or high-tech front, it can provide a lot of the investment to boost up the tech the high-tech the high-tech industrial capacity that Europe also needs. So there's a lot of what South Korea can provide, but at the same time, as I mentioned, Europe and NATO have different ecosystems and different needs and different political and military requirements. So how do you navigate that? It's art. So you have to really understand how Brussels work, understand how defense industry, the European defense industry, how protective they are at the same time, right? And so how do you leverage these partnerships without navigating, these potential misperceptions. But I see, bottom line, I see a real opportunity for both Europe and South Korea to strengthen the security cooperation. I think that's what's really all about. South Korea was always working with the US on security and defense. Now it has an opportunity to work with Europe, and Europe has an opportunity to work with South Korea, and in a broader context with the US ROK alliances and in Indo-Pacific, and really where you can join forces along a lot of these projects that will come online, and they are already in the pipeline.
Thank you, Darcie. You mentioned a critical point that South Korea's chip industry, shipbuilding, other high-tech ecosystems may not be directly involved in defense, but as a tide rises together, it does play a critical role. So from where you sit as you investigate these technology issues, what does South Korea's other critical industries, non-military, for example, how can they help South Korea's overall, competitiveness in the global supply chain?
Yeah. I think the key word for me here is where does Korea industry see itself in global value chains, right? So not just global supply chains, but where is it positioning itself in key emerging industrial sectors? And so this is a slightly different than how Korea experiences rapid catch-up industrialization, where it sought to kind of have a stepwise kind of way to catch up to advanced economies. But right now, Korea is actually being forced to kind of leapfrog and choose where it puts its capacity and interests strategically. So it can't do everything at once. But this is where Korea has a comparative advantage already, because it's essentially has such competitiveness in these very important components of broader ecosystems, like the chips and the batteries, I think in particular, are where it's really shining. But the other thing that I think is really worth mentioning is this also speaks to the broader trend of technological industrial dimension, is that development is that there's always a dual use dimension to these technologies. So it's something that Korea is also has a choice with, is how it's going to be positioning its own industries for the future of global security, for global industry going forward.
Okay, great. Thank you. Markus, as we wrap up this session, which has been really illuminating from my end, what are your closing thoughts on how South Korea can really become a crucial partner, not just selling arms to our European friends, but a bilateral and even in certain cases, multilateral partnership with our European partners?
Yeah, so I'll build actually on the industrial conversation and broaden it. So I have three overall recommendations. I think the first is the importance of South Korea really both adopting and then influencing the standardization in NATO, to emphasize the interoperability, to learn from as much as possible the procedures, the doctrine that NATO is using, even on things like nuclear deterrence, but then also to even begin to influence the technological standards that are used in NATO, recognizing that if everyone's working from a common baseline of technological interoperability and even doctrinal interoperability, that's going to allow the relationship to move to the next level. And it'll also have huge effects, I think, on the competitiveness of South Korean defense articles in European countries. The second thing that's very critical is the technological cooperation going back and forth, to view the relationship in longer iterative terms of looking at not just the exchange of essentially money for hardware, but how can the exchange of technological developments, sharing of insights, and co-development could actually contribute over the long term, even if it involves accepting some risk and maybe not being the optimum profit-making strategy in the short term. It's certainly bears both economic and strategic dividends in the long term. And the third thing, a very specific recommendation, is that South Korea should really focus very heavily on counter-drone capability, because this is the future of warfare. It's the present day of warfare, actually, in Ukraine. And given, of course, that both North Korea and China are also developing drone capabilities based on observations of what's going on in Europe, I think this is a huge area where again, South Korea could benefit from the battlefield experience that Europeans are getting, but really provide the capacity and the innovation to make effective, efficient, cost-effective counter-drone capabilities viable, because we know there's a huge hunger in Europe right now for the ability to counter drones, and this is one area where South Korea could help, both in a way that would aid European security, but also is really vital for the future of South Korean defense and deterrence to be able to counter drones, particularly swarming autonomous drones. So those are the three recommendations I have for South Korea.
Thank you. Yiki, do you have any final thoughts from industry?
Yes. So the next phase of the South Korea and Europe defense cooperation must move beyond contracts and into the institutional integration. So we are usually saying at the three practical steps. One is that train and operate together. So South Korea already participated in the joint exercises within the NATO with the NATO countries, but expanding participation is especially in the EU-led or the NATO-enabled exercises will allow us our systems or C2 or logistical chains to be tested at the same environment. So interoperability is not certified on the PowerPoint, but it is owned in the joint exercises. So the second thing is that produce inside Europe, not just ship to Europe, which is Korean firms are already manufacturing in Europe, like Hanwha, but the real pivot is assessing the EU's defense industrial instrument, particularly SAFE, the EU's defense industrial program, the subsequent joint procurement funds. So if Korean companies co-produce in Europe and with European labor and value creation, then they should be eligible to participate in those frameworks. So the third but last step, what we are usually saying is that evolve the procurement, not just the platforms. Long-term security cooperation requires the procurement system. So what we need is the long-term procurement systems. So in short, if we integrate exercise, production, and procurement, then the Korea-European cooperation stops being transactional, but we become transformational.
Well, Yiki, on that note, I could not have asked for a better audience, both from Korea, from Singapore, and here in Washington. So let me thank all of you for your great points. My final thought is this. For the last 50 years, for example, or even longer, we've been used to, for example, hearing about Five Eyes, the joint intelligence cooperation between the U.S. and like-minded states. I think over the next 5, 10, 15 plus years, we need a new Five Eyes or 5 AIs. So this is where I believe that the Koreans can play a critical role. Hanwha has everything from aerospace to land vehicles to maritime domains. It's all going to be integrated. And the most important aspect of this is a joint ISR capability going forward. And I believe this is where the Koreans, in their own way, can contribute to defense of NATO and vice versa. And Markus is very correct. The drone is not only on air, but also on submersible drones are going to be the next frontier of conflicts. So that's something that the Koreans have a huge advantage in, given our prowess in shipbuilding and naval construction. So without further ado, let me thank our colleagues, Catherine and Alex and others, who put all this together at Carnegie. Let me thank my dear friend Darcie for basically holding the fort here in DC and for her great work on technology advancement. Michael, who is the RMA guru that I've known for 15 years, and he's going to be focusing much more on European defense. Markus, as usual, is the sage who is able to give us insights from a deeper, I guess, ROK US European strategic perspective. And last but not least, Yea, thank you for giving us the corporate industrial view. All of us are not working in corporations like you are, but it's refreshing to have someone who really knows what they're talking about. So on that note, thank you very much. Good night and good morning in Washington, and see you all very soon.